"We call it," replied the cripple, "the 8-chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hop Frog, "lies in the fright it occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I'll equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of the masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you." "The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped, en masse, from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8-chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of the delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable." "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8, by ocular demonstration, that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of the tar. A long chain was now procured. First it was passed around the waist of the king, and tied, then about another of the party, and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted, at the present day, by those captured chimpanzees, or other large apes, in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but, in order to not look unsightly, this ladder passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to the Trupetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep from out the center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in the various parts of the hall out of the way, and a flambeau, emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in all together, for the impediments of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright. Had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up upon its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain in the intersection of the 2 portions which had crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans closer in connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered, in some measure, from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me! I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatides, he returned as he went to the center of the room, leaped with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are!" And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent, that a dead silence, of about a minute's duration, ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Pt.2. But on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth, and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are, now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coach which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely, amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity, and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar, to which it had adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Pt.2, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in this fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.